Thank you to the organizers of TEDxEuston. Chikwe and Ike, is really good that you create a space where we could all meet and talk. And thank you for coming along on a bleak Saturday afternoon to share ideas. Stories are attempts, I think, to impose order on random events. Some of the oldest stories in the world are African, given that humanity first saw light in Africa. So from the earliest days on the East African savanna to the first civilizations in the Nile Valley, we know that people from our continent have told complex stories to guide them through life. Today I want to talk about stories of African sovereignty, unity, and peace. And I think all three are linked, and I'm going to try and link them, and so if you give me some time, I'll explain. I'm an Igbo from southeastern Nigeria. Many of you here who would know of Igbo land because it's the place that our most masterful writer, Chinua Achebe, writes so eloquently about. Until the early 20th century and the conquest by the British, political authority in this area of eastern Nigeria generally rested with sovereign and independent villages. And these villages were governed by a council of older men, generally. The source of the authority of these older men was usually embedded in a story. And it was a story of them as an agricultural people. And the story was told of how they created their villages, how they subjugated the land, and the land was very important so that they could do their agriculture, and how those villages were generally created by related siblings. The contemporary governing council that then would rule after the original creators of the village, the descendants were the descendants of those original siblings. So the basis of authority and legitimacy in all the villages was linked to blood and land. Being an oral culture, the story was continuously handed down the generations, and those stories would tell how those brothers and their descendants and their families and others subsequently evolved rules that would ensure justice, peace, and harmonious living. One of the first and most important rules for peace was that conflict was to be resolved through discussion. And the second was usually against the spilling of blood of kinfolk. And in Igbo land, that is considered the worst abomination, that you spill the blood of kinfolk. I guess they didn't have a problem with others. But kinfolk, there was a big problem around that. And in time, this second rule against the spilling of blood would assume the status of a taboo, and the breaking of which was punishable by the ultimate. Achebe's masterpiece, The Arrow of God, is a story of how some of these Igbo political communities are not just created, but are also expanded, and how they continue to maintain order, peace, and keep chaos at bay. In that story, there are 6 villages that are threatened by a neighboring clan of slave raiders. And what they do is something that we all do when we are under threat. They come together and form a larger unity called Umaru. And at the center of the new town, in order for those 6 villages to come together, they create a new spirit and unleash a new spirit, or a new god. And the god is called Ulu. And the god is overseen by the chief priest who's at the center of the novel, Eze Ulu, or literally the king of Ulu, the new god. The guardian of Ulu, Eze Ulu, is from the smallest of the 6 villages, and the weakest of the 6 federated villages. And so that the people who were creating this new political entity understood that they didn't want to be threatened, or as Achebe said, swallowed by the more powerful villages. So they gave the power in this new federation to the weakest village. In the new federation of Umaru, the 6 federated villages maintained a degree of independence. So they all kept their individual shrines. A little bit like the EU, I suppose. We all keep a little bit of ourselves, but you hand over to the bigger entity the main power. So they kept all their individual shrines, but the new spirit of Ulu would be the arbiter and the final of all final judgment. So it would be at the head, and all of them would bow, and I mean bow, to this new God. And of course, the guardian of the new God was the chief priest. And the conflict in the book was the conflict that the chief priest has with the rest of the villages after he feels betrayed by them as their leader. And it's a wonderful novel, I think far superior to Things Fall Apart. And if you get a chance, read it again, because I think it speaks a lot to what we might be considering to do in Africa. My own village, as with other Igbo villages, was also at the heart, what kept it together was a story. So the story of my village was that it was formed by 6 related brothers. And the brother from which I am descended is called Udo, which literally means peace. So all of us, his direct descendants, are called Umu Udo, which literally means children of peace. So peace and the maintenance of peace has been something that you could say is literally in my blood. My story, or stories of hope, today is about how we might maintain on our continent peace. In the last 50 years, the conflicts have been many on our continent, forgetting the anti-colonial struggles, which were necessary in Algeria, Kenya, Angola, South Africa, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe. There were a lot. We have had generations of civil wars in my own country, Nigeria, in Sudan, Congo, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Chad, Algeria, Somalia, Côte d'Ivoire, and then others that perhaps have not assumed the status of civil wars but have been simmering internal conflicts. We had one in Kenya recently, Zimbabwe, of course, Guinea, that is unfolding at the moment, Central African Republic, and too many to mention. So why have we found it so difficult to maintain peace on our continent? I would argue that the reason is that we play at independence. And again, I want to link this idea of peace, sovereignty, and independence. And we play at independence and sovereignty, but we are not truly, or we don't truly kind of believe that the independence or the idea of the sovereignty. Because I think that ultimately, an important way of understanding the concept of sovereignty is to understand it in relation to the idea of peace and stability. First of all, peace is dependent not on the absence of conflict, because there's always conflict. Peace is dependent on the ability to resolve conflict and the mechanisms to resolve conflict. So I'll give you an example, like small children. When small children are playing and they can't resolve disputes themselves, the adults get involved. And in Africa, what generally happens is that when we can't resolve conflicts amongst ourselves, then the adults, in this case, the international community, whatever that means, or the UN, step in. To illustrate this, I'll take an example. And the one I'll take is the one of the recent disputed elections in Kenya. Kenya is a sovereign nation. It reached an internal impasse. A large number of people believed the elections had been stolen and began agitating. The head of the Electoral Commission, the body that was supposed to referee a fair contest, abdicated his responsibility, behaving, I think, disgracefully and impartially. And then the Chief Justice of Kenya, the country's most senior person empowered to provide arbitration and fair judgment, crowned Kibaki president, endorsing a vote many felt had been won not by right, but by might. The police began to enforce this might, although to its eternal credit, the army, the other powerful institution in the land, stayed out of the argument. At this point, peace disappeared and the country exploded. The violence and the conflict was an admission of two things. First, that Kenyans, like small children, could no longer resolve their problems by themselves. And second, they were going to begin trading away their sovereignty and independence. This began to happen almost immediately. The opposition quickly sought to internationalize the conflict. Sure, none of us in Africa is an island. All our countries have pulled away our sovereignty, first to our local regional bodies, and in our case in West Africa to ECOWAS, in East Africa to the ECA, or EAC. And then we've pulled it to other bodies, the AU at the continental level, and then we pulled it to the UN at the global level. You would have thought that having failed to resolve their dispute at the national level in Kenya, that they would then go to the next level up, which was the East African Community, or at least at the AU level. Instead, at the early stages of the crisis, there was a great deal of resistance and a lack of trust of the East African Community and of the AU within large parts of Kenyan society. There were strident demands for the UN or the international community to get involved, before wiser councils eventually prevailed and Kofi Annan was appointed mediator by the AU. For me, the danger here was clear. If your national, regional, and continental bodies cannot be trusted to resolve conflicts, what kind of sovereignty are we talking about in Africa? Contrast this with the US elections that brought Bush W to power, a crisis that was resolved by the highest power of arbitration in the US, the Supreme Court. Once it issued its judgment, everybody bowed down and accepted that judgment. Elsewhere, here in Europe, after years of wars and conflict, which left millions dead and the Germans and the Eastern Europeans under occupation and without their sovereignty, the countries of Europe after World War II set up the EU, and most critically agreed that henceforth they would resolve their disputes without violence. They also agreed to accept the judgments of their various courts on human rights, on commercial matters, standards, etc. Since then, Europe has been an oasis of peace. Its sovereignty is not threatened. Wars, yes, have raged, but they tend to be on the edges, where the former Yugoslavia, for instance, where these values have not been accepted. So I'm arguing that peace and stability is not guaranteed because there is no conflict. Conflict is always there. Peace and peace is guaranteed because those enjoying peace have worked out effective mechanisms for resolving conflict. They have created fair and transparent rules and systems that those under them consider legitimate and which in turn perpetuate themselves without conflict. And most importantly, not only do they ensure that those rules are policed and enforced impartially, they also guarantee a system of arbitration or final judgment to settle all disputes. When you get to the end of the road of appeals, whether you are in the right or not, you accept the judgment. Not because you're always wrong, sometimes you're right, but you accept the judgment as we do here when the judges rule, even if you're innocent, because you believe it is unbiased and there has been a search for the truth. This happens at village level in Nigeria, where rather than enter into the Nigerian court system, most people in Nigeria go to their local systems of arbitration, whether it's at village level or whatever. In the north, it would be Sharia courts, because they feel that they can get fair justice. And it would be done swiftly, and there would have been a serious attempt at getting at the truth. So once the judgment is issued, you do not go into the bush to win by violence what you were denied at the judgment. This system of settling final disputes through arbitration and final judgment is as old as time in Africa, and we shouldn't keep accepting these, that, we have to learn lessons from outside in Africa. We created families in Africa because the first families were created on the East African savannah. We created most of the rules that families and the relationships and everything else. And in Africa, we still believe that we have to go outside to learn fundamental lessons that actually were evolved on our continent. The story of how you resolve violence through a judgment, as I said, is as old as time. It's at the heart of the oldest written story about conflict resolution in the world. And the story of how peace came to a warring nephew and uncle duo, Horus and Seth, in ancient Egypt. At stake was the usual issue of power and who would rule. And the story unfolds with the formation of the world. This is how the ancient Egyptians told it. When the 9 initial building blocks of creation, the Great Council, were formed. The first building block was the self-created Atum, who the Egyptians understood as God, who created himself from the void and in the end gave birth to male and female twins, light and moisture, Shu and Tefnut. They in turn gave birth to their children, the next paired twins, Geb, who is the earth, and Nut, who is sky. And the union of Geb and Nut produced the first human family. The eldest was Osiris, followed by Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. The drama involving the 4 humans of this Grand Council of 9 is arguably the first documented love story and tale of reconciliation in the world. One version contained in the Shabaka text tells of how Osiris, after marrying his sister Isis, becomes the Pharaoh of Egypt. His younger brother Seth is consumed by jealousy, and Seth is married to the other sister, Nephthys. Seth eventually murders Osiris, cuts his body into 14 pieces, and scatters the remains all over Egypt. And Seth then becomes Pharaoh. Osiris's distraught wife, with the help of her sister, Nephthys, goes in search of the pieces of her beloved husband. She finds the discarded remains and reassembles Osiris's body, creating the first mummy, and then does an amazing thing where she sleeps with the mummy for one night and immaculately conceives a son, Horus. Horus is raised secretly in the marshes of the Nile to hide him from his vengeful uncle, now seen a threat to his throne. And Seth is right to be worried, because when Horus comes of age, he sets out to avenge his father and fight for his throne. For 80 years, according to this version of the story, Seth and his uncle fight to decide who is going to rule Egypt. Finally, the Grand Council decide that this has gone on long enough after 80 years, and they call the council in to settle the dispute. So you have Atum and the 2 pairs of twins, and then the 4 humans. And they come together in the council, and they meet, and after long deliberations, which again I think in some versions last as long as 80 years, hearing evidence, appeals, and setting various tests, the Grand Council eventually settled its dispute by imposing a judgment, and that judgment is accepted by all. They decide in favor of right, that Horus, and not might, Seth. They decide that Horus becomes Pharaoh because he did not shed blood for the throne. Legitimacy would in future derive from his mother, Isis, the female line, whose hieroglyphic symbol subsequently was the throne or seat of power in Egypt, which is why the female line of descent in Egypt was always through the woman, and why pharaohs always had to marry their sisters in order to inherit the throne. Seth is also given an area to rule over, so he's not completely in the judgment ignored, but they give him the desert wastelands and at the edges of civilization. So they understood something, because all of these are allegories, that essentially Seth is a sign for chaos, but you do need chaos, but you need to keep chaos outside of civilization, at the edges. But it is a force that is needed. And indeed, in some subsequent traditions, you could only become king if you are both, and your legitimacy only it derives if the lands of Horus and Seth are united under one standard. Meanwhile, the dead Osiris is given the Netherlands to rule over, becoming the symbol of the ancestral past and the point of transition between the living and the dead. So, over 4,000 years later, the sophistication of the judgment of the council is still relevant for us in Africa. Right is given ultimate power, but unity is preserved by also recognizing might, through sharing some of that power and territory. Finally, conflict is resolved not through fighting, but by a council hearing evidence and sitting in judgment. This council's authority to impose a decision is recognized by all, because the body enjoys enormous spiritual and moral legitimacy. So today, my question to all of us is, where is such a contemporary body that can impose such a ruling? Formally, there is the possibility that judges from the African Court of Justice might evolve into such a body. Informally, Africa continues to throw them up. The group of presidents that convinced Charles Taylor to step down from power, I would argue, is such a Grand Council. But perhaps the most interesting informal body is the group known as the Elders, comprising Mandela, Bishop Tutu, and Kofi Annan, who I think see themselves as going in to arbitrate and try and resolve conflicts. And indeed, Kofi Annan was able to bring a semblance of peace to Kenya. We wait to see what happens in the next elections. But the final point I do want to make is that, is to wonder if it is possible that we can constitute an eminent group of respected people who can sit in council and be trusted to decide in favor of right while recognizing might, so that we can continue to protect and enlarge our sovereignty and independence in Africa. And also, my final appeal would be that we can begin to put in place a powerful taboo against the spilling of African blood. And that truly would be a new story of hope. Thanks.